Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Charmaine Wilkerson is a novelist who likes to anchor her stories in things. She uses the history of objects as a way of communicating something about the history of her characters. She's got a new book out now called Good Dirt, and in it, she uses a jar made by enslaved people to tell the story of an affluent black family. But first, we're going to do some tracing back of our own and hear about Wilkerson's debut novel, Black Cake. Back when it came out in 2022, she spoke with NPR's Kelsey Snell about the history of Black Cake and how it reflects her character's constant changing sense of identity. That's up ahead.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Cunard, inviting you to take in the sounds of Alaska. Relax on spacious decks with 360-degree views as you cruise through Glacier Bay National Park. Hear the call of a bald eagle or the song of a humpback whale as you take in the beauty of Alaska's snow-capped mountains from your own private balcony. More at cunard.com/Alaska.
Eleanor Bennett, a widow and mother, concealed a life of heartache with half-truths and lies of omission, but she did not want to take her secrets to the grave. Instead, she left behind a recording for her son Byron, a famous oceanographer, and her estranged and struggling daughter, Benny.
You children need to know about your family, about where we come from, about how I really met your father. You two need to know about your sister. Byron and Benny look at each other, mouths open. B&B, I know this is a shock. Just bear with me for a moment and let me explain.
In Charmaine Wilkerson's swirling new novel, Black Cake, that explanation upends everything Byron and Benny thought they knew about their mother, their family, and themselves. Charmaine Wilkerson joins us now. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Kelsey. It's wonderful to be here.
I want to get this out of the way first. For those who don't know, what is Black Cake?
Black cake is a traditional Caribbean fruitcake, and it's essentially an evolved version of the good old-fashioned English plum pudding. So it's different. It has fruit that's been soaked in rum, dark brown cane sugar is used, so it speaks to the agriculture and tradition of the Caribbean islands, while it's really been taken from the English tradition. And that's part of the untold story of the Black Cake in the novel Black Cake.
You know, it's that evolution and those relationships that I think really are part of, the propeller of this book. Eleanor Bennett's revelations just move the book along, moving us from the islands to the UK to California. So let's start with Byron and Benny and what they thought they knew about their mother. What did they think they knew before they heard the recording?
Well, they knew that their mother and father had come from a Caribbean island, which is not named in the book. They understood that their parents had both met in the United Kingdom and then moved to the United States. Byron and Benny were born and raised in California. They were once inseparable. At the time that their mother dies, they haven't seen each other for years. There's been a huge rift in their family. But what they both have is a love for their mother and a memory of this rambunctious, athletic woman who was very smart, but she also had these quirks. She loved to surf. She loved MTV music videos. So, she was just this unusual, energetic, charismatic woman. And she loved to bake cakes.
And they're deeply estranged at this point, but they do have that, that shared memory, that shared feeling. But then they learn about betrayal, about trauma, and love as Eleanor's voice tells them about her life. What made you want to tell this specific story?
Well, when I write, I tend to just start with a scene. And this story came to me first. There was this idea of these two teenage girls who were different from others, who kind of were running up against the expectations and stereotypes of other people. And I think that feeling that first came to me was the idea of, who do you believe yourself to be? What's at your core? And how do you navigate the world around you?
Secrets evolve from some of that. Of the way that people hide parts of their identity becomes very important and is at the root of some of the biggest misunderstandings between Byron and Benny in particular. There's a moment early on when they're taking a break from their mother's recording and they get into this fight. And Benny says, and I'm going to the quote from the book here, she says, "We had to be perfect to make up for the fact that our family was built on a colossal lie." What's going on in that moment for Byron and for Benny?
Well, Byron and Benny both identify as African Americans, and Benny always thought that she was expected to be, the high achiever, the perfect daughter, because they are a Black family in America. And she is beginning to find out that maybe her parents were so insistent on a certain level of achievement and also keeping some things out of the public eye in terms of your identity and your lifestyle, because they were afraid. They had something to hide, but their children didn't know it. And so she's feeling a lot of anger because she felt held to very high standards. She felt that she was always disappointing her parents. And then she starts to think, maybe this wasn't about me. Maybe this was about them.
This story has so many kind of earth-shattering revelations and changes to the way that, Benny and Byron relate to their own identities, to who they are. But near the end, Eleanor says to her children, at some point in the recording, "After all of these revelations about her past, you do know who I am." What point is she making about identity there?
What she's trying to say is that even if the stories she told about herself originally in raising her children were not quite true, even if they've learned things about where she's been, one thing hasn't changed. She is their mother. And she's trying to say something about the importance of love and the importance of relationships, that those also form part of your identity. She's trying to say that some part of that never changes. And what she's trying to say is that they have not changed. Her children are still her children.
I walked away from Black Cake thinking about the hidden choices women are forced to make when the world fails them. I've also been thinking about all I don't know about the choices people I love have had to make. How do you think about the secrets that kept your characters from really knowing one another?
Well, I think one of the things that, and certainly this in my family, I think about this sometimes, is when I was a little girl, I'd hear stories. Then when I became old enough to hear certain things, maybe I heard a slightly different version. And that kind of makes me think, yes, there's so much we don't know about our parents and the people who came before. And often we think, oh, our parents, they don't understand me. They've never been in love. They've never gone through this. They don't know what's happening. But what's really happening is the child is not necessarily understanding the parent. And, maybe sometimes we don't know because, well, it's just not something they share. Our lives are built on stories. Our identities, our family histories are shaped by the stories that we are told from one generation to another. And they're also shaped by the stories that are not told.
That's Charmaine Wilkerson. Her new novel is Black Cake. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Kelsey.
This message comes from Schwab. At Schwab, how you invest is your choice, not theirs. That's why when it comes to managing your wealth, Schwab gives you more choices. You can invest and trade on your own. Plus, get advice and more comprehensive wealth solutions to help meet your unique needs. With award-winning service, low costs, and transparent advice, you can manage your wealth your way at Schwab. Visit schwab.com to learn more.
For her newest book, Good Dirt, it's a jar that Wilkerson is using as a prism to examine a family. In this interview with NPR's Juana Summers, Wilkerson talks about how much of the story came from doing research and what she learned about the mass production of stoneware by enslaved people. Here's Juana.
In the opening pages of a new novel, Good Dirt, a young girl is playing with her older brother. They've decorated an old stoneware jar, adding a baseball cap, a handlebar mustache made out of paper. The jar ends up another character in a family photograph with the girl, the boy, and their parents. The boy, we soon learn, is Baz. His sister is Ebby, and that old jar is a cornerstone of their family's story, which is told over generations. The book is Good Dirt, and author Charmaine Wilkerson joins us now to discuss it. Welcome back to All Things Considered.
Thanks very much.
Charmaine, I just want to start at the beginning, if we can, with the idea that inspired for you the story of Ebby and Baz and of this jar. I want to know, where did you start? What character came first for you?
Well, the character that came first was Ebby. Ebby Freeman is Ebony Freeman, and she really just popped right into my head on the worst day of her life, and that's connected to the thought that sort of inspired this character. It really came from an emotional question in my mind and in my life.
Tell us a bit more about Ebby. Who is she? What is she like?
Ebby is an African-American young woman who's grown up under privileged circumstances. She lives in this gorgeous community in Connecticut. She loves being from an old New England family, but Ebby has decided that she needs to run away from home at age 29. She goes to France temporarily because she's convinced that the only way to distance herself from painful memories from her past, a family tragedy, and a very embarrassing and public romantic breakup is to get away from everyone she knows and everything she knows.
What is it that made you want to explore this idea of how a personal tragedy can shape a person's identity and really the course of their life?
I began my professional life in television news. And so from a very young age, from age 21, I would find myself walking into a person's home on the worst day of their life. And I think that you can identify with this, meeting people under terrible circumstances and then going home later and wondering, how will they move forward? How will they do this? Especially when they've become news, when their personal pain is now in the public eye.
This book takes two tracks. There is, of course, the story of Ebby and her family in the present day, but we also begin to learn the stories of previous generations of the family and the story of that old stoneware jar that we later learned to call Old Mo. And you hint at this in the opening pages of your book, that the jar is a character, that it's really a part of Ebby and Baz's family. Can you just tell us why it was so important?
So you hit on the opening scene in which she and her brother, Ebby and Baz, are playing around with the jar. They're decorating it. They're dressing it up like a person because they're still children. But it is of great serious importance because it is a jar that has come into their family by way of an enslaved ancestor. And the story of how that jar ends up being made in the American South and finds its way to Massachusetts and remains in that family for generations and becomes so important to the family is that sort of backstory of the Freeman family.
I won't give away much of the plot, but I have to say one of the things I found most compelling when I was reading this book was how deeply you dove into the history of pottery making, stretching from the American South all the way to West Africa. What made you decide to dive into that so deeply, and how did you approach that part of your writing?
For me, it was a process of discovery. I'm one of those writers who I start from a point of emotion. You know, this character came to me and I thought, I'm going to follow her. The very first thing I wrote about Ebby, there's a scene in which an antique jar falls from a table. And I started to look into the history of what that jar would be. Where would it come from? And really, so much of that story came from a learning process for me. I learned about the mass production of stoneware by enslaved people, usually men, primarily in the part of the American South that we now call South Carolina, also Georgia, because they had special soil that allowed them to make this kind of clay. And the title of the book, Good Dirt, is a reference in part to the idea of having good dirt that allows you to make very special clay. So much of the story was the result of my own exploration, things that I did not know or might have heard of became the backstory for this young woman, Abby Freeman.
The central role that this jar plays in Abby's family and her story made me think a lot about the impact of things that we inherit and the way that they impact our identities and our families and how we see ourselves. And I just wonder, is there an object like that jar that plays a specific role of significance in your own family?
I come from a very different family from the fictional Abby. So, across 2 or 3 generations, my elders came from different countries and different cultures. But in my debut novel, Black Cake, I invent a character for whom a very prized inheritance is a recipe. And that is something that I inherited from my own mother. She really did make what some people call black cake, what she called rum pudding. The recipe was important. The stories were important. And really what the story Good Dirt is at the heart is not a story about a tangible inheritance, Old Mo, the stoneware jar. It's a story about the intangible, because there is no tangible without the intangible. If we're talking about inheritance of culture, it's really about the stories. The family feels great affection for a tangible object, this stoneware jar, but it's really about the emotion and the culture and the stories that have helped to shape the family.
I want to end, if I can, on a personal note. This book is a multi-layered, multi-generational telling of an American story. As you wrote it, what did you learn from it? What did you take away from it yourself?
I would say that in writing this, I continued to deepen my thinking about the power of stories to shape our identities. The story that is handed down from one generation to another, the story that we tell others about ourselves, and in this particular case, the stamp that trauma can leave on one's identity. So what is the challenge facing Abby Freeman? In a way, the challenge for her is to find a way to rewrite or reconfigure her relationship with an episode that was so traumatic in her life that it has dominated, it continues to dominate her adult life. So she's, we hope, going to find a new way to write her story.
Author Charmaine Wilkerson, her latest book is Good Dirt. Charmaine, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. If you want more, you can sign up for our newsletter at npr.org/newsletter/books. I'm Andrew Limbong. The podcast is produced by Danica Panetta and Chloe Weiner and edited by Megan Sullivan. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Adriana Gallardo, Lily Q. Rose, Samantha Balaban, Andrew Craig, Martha Ann Overland, Ryan Benk, Dee Pravaz, Ashley Brown, Elena Burnett, Justine Kennan, and Matt Ozick. Yolanda Sanguini is our executive producer. Thanks for listening.
This message comes from Best Western Hotels and Resorts. If you love a good podcast, then you must love a good story. And the best stories start with a great trip. That's where Best Western comes in. Whether you've been planning a getaway for weeks or just got the itch to go, Best Western has you covered with over 4,000 hotels worldwide. Wherever your story takes you, make it memorable. Life's a trip. Make the most of it at bestwestern.com. This message comes from Homes.com. You don't just live in your home, you live in your neighborhood as well. So when you're shopping for a home, you want to know as much about the area around it as possible. Luckily, Homes.com has got you covered. Each listing features a comprehensive neighborhood guide from local experts. Everything you'd ever want to know about a neighborhood, including the number of homes for sale, local amenities, and even things like median lot size and a noise score. Homes.com. We've done your homework.